So far, we've discussed how sometimes people like to be congruent with, well, okay, let's start over. So far, we've discussed how on some occasions people's cognitions are congruent with the mood that they're in. We've also discussed how mood can influence the processing style that we use to interact with our surroundings. Now, let's discuss how our mood might actually be something that we want to regulate or that we have to regulate. Now, what do I mean by this? Um, Mood is also something that we sometimes need to manage because you could say that we have something like a goal to maintain a positive mood just because it feels better and to repair a negative mood to make ourselves feel better again. And in order to achieve this goal of, well, maximizing hedonistic cognitions, we can be strategic in how we process information. For instance, if you are in a negative mood, you need to repair that mood and to feel better. If you think positive thoughts and do pleasant things, that might result in you recalling more positive things from memory and in evaluating your surroundings more positively, which could, in the end, have effects on improving your mood. So, if we follow this logic, that might mean that people who are in a sad state, who have sad emotions, they might actually recall more happy memories and rate objects more positively than happy people in order to make themselves feel better again. Now, of course, this is the exact opposite of our mood congruence idea from the beginning. So you could say it depends on whether people engage in mood regulation or in mood congruence. So cases where we don't engage in strategic mood management, if you will, well, you can pause and think of a couple of situations. So for instance, if you're at a funeral, you don't try to strategically improve your mood, but often we think this is a place of mourning where indeed we should feel sad about a person's passing. When we're alone, we might not have so many reasons to strategically change our mood. Well, because we don't affect other people with it, so we might not feel like we have to make ourselves feel cheerier than we actually are. And of course, if someone has depression, that might mean they have a general inability to or difficulties to regulate their mood in a way that might help them repair their mood if it's bad. And of course, depression is not just about bad mood. But what I'm trying to say is that the social context, the norms and goals, and whatever else is going on in our environment, this might guide whether we engage in such mood management or mood regulation, or if we stick with the mood congruent processing. So you could say it depends. Either if you feel good, you search for positive information and avoid negative information just because you want to feel good. Or maybe you have a different motivation to try to interact with the world. For instance, to find out what is true and false, to search for reliable information and for accurate feedback. So we sometimes find ourselves in the dilemma of whether we want to be happy or whether we want to know the truth. And we are often painfully aware of our own efforts to get rid of a sad feeling by thinking positively, but at the same time we know or we are afraid that we are deluding ourselves. And we have basically a bit of a dilemma between feeling good and being accurate. Here is where the mood as a resource idea comes in. So if we have two contrasting goals, one to feel good about ourselves and the other to learn and improve and find out the truth about our environment, here positive mood can enhance people's ability to act according to their long-term goals rather than according to competing short-term outcomes. So if you follow this reasoning, it would be as if you would say that positive mood is basically a buffer resource. It can boost what you're able to withstand, and make you capable of following through with your long-term plans, even though that doesn't maybe feel super great at the moment. So positive mood could facilitate elaborate processing of emotionally aversive but potentially useful information. And I'm going to show you a study where self-relevance is also a moderator of whether people are interested in withstanding such emotionally aversive but potentially useful information. This is to say that positive mood may affect processing in two ways. So either if you receive information or feedback that is not relevant to yourself, well, then you could say we can adapt this mood as information perspective. So positive mood meaning, well, everything's going well, we're a-okay, there is no need to further elaborate. While we're in a negative mood, we would have the feeling, oh, something is wrong, I need to elaborate more to actually achieve my processing goal. However, if feedback is diagnostic, we might have the goal to learn and improve, and that is when the mood as resource idea kicks in. So if we're in a positive mood, we might actually search for more negative information so that we can learn and improve, because we're already feeling good. This is a buffer against making us feel bad, and we can engage in the onslaught of negative information, and we can stand it, we can bear it. While in a negative mood, we can't deal with it, and therefore we try to look for positive information to, first of all, guard ourselves from more negative information that might make us feel even worse, and to potentially also improve our mood. So now, here is the study that I promised you. And in this study, the participants were low versus high caffeine consumers, and they went through a mood induction. So either they were given positive or a negative test feedback, and then that would induce either a positive or a negative affect. And after that, participants read on an essay on the health benefits and risks of using caffeine. So you can already tell that high caffeine consumers, for them, learning about the risks and benefits of ingesting caffeine is relevant, while low caffeine consumers, for them, it's just not as relevant, right? So here we have the self-relevance as a moderator, and we also have an induction of positive versus negative mood. So now, did participants regulate their mood or use their mood as information? To find that out, the measure here was to recall positive versus negative information, so we can find out which information is retrieved more. And a second dependent variable was change in affect. So before and after, how happy, elated, sad, and depressed did participants feel? And the hypothesis, of course, would be when information is self-relevant, so for the high caffeine consumers who are actually exposed to risks, and for people who are in this target group and they're in a positive mood, they would have a goal to improve and to learn. They would have the truth-seeking motivation, so to say, and therefore they would engage in deeper processing, also of threatening information. And therefore, they should have better memory for negative information. So let's take a look at the results in this study. First of all, this is the high relevance group. So these are the high caffeine users. And then we have the recall on the y-axis and split up for participants who were put in a positive or a negative mood. That's on the x-axis. And then we have different colored bars for whether the items recalled were positive or negative items. And what we can see is that participants who were in the positive mood condition recalled fewer positive items than negative items if they were in the higher relevance group. And we see the exact opposite picture if we're looking at the negative mood. Participants who were induced to have a negative mood because of the false feedback, remember, they could recall more positive items than negative items. So what do we have going on here? Participants in the negative mood, they didn't have positive mood basically as a resource, as a buffer to shield them against negative information, which is why they accessed more positive items and saved them to memory and then were able to retrieve them, so as to regulate their mood, or at least not feel worse because they were exposed to negative items. On the other hand, participants who were in a positive mood, they had this mood as a resource. They had this buffer. They had the ability to focus on negative items and to recall them more even than positive items because they didn't have to feel threatened by them. And instead, they could actually learn something from this article about potential risks of their behavior. Now, if we look at the low relevance group, what do we see here? So these are the people who don't regularly ingest a lot of caffeine. Now, if these low relevance group participants were in the positive mood, we see that both for the positive and for the negative mood, there wasn't a big difference in the recall for positive versus negative items, right? You can see there's not a lot of evidence that positive or negative items had an edge in the low relevance groups' memories. But you can see that overall, people in the negative mood condition recalled a bit better than in the positive mood condition. So this is generally evidence that would be okay, or like it would fit with our mood and mood as information idea. So participants who are in a positive mood, they don't even process so much information, perhaps because their positive mood makes them feel like everything is a-okay and they don't need to invest so much effort in this specific setting. And this is also efficient because they might have resources left to do well in another subsequent task. Remember, this is what we discussed in the previous block of this course. But in the negative mood, these low relevance participants, they were motivated to access some more information. They could retrieve more and perform better in this recall task. So this fits actually for the low relevance group. The results actually fit our mood as information hypothesis. So what we see here is that we kind of have both going on. We see evidence for mood as information, but at the same time also for mood as resource. And whether we see the one or the other thing depends in this case on whether the information that is presented is relevant for the participants. So now we might not only want to look at the performance, but also at how people feel before and after reading about the potential risks and benefits of ingesting caffeine, depending on whether they were in the high relevance group, so the high caffeine ingesters, or the low relevance group, people who don't ingest a lot of caffeine anyway. So what we have here on the x-axis is again people who are either in a positive mood or a negative mood, and on the y-axis this time it's the changes in emotions. And different scores are often kind of more difficult to read, so let's take our time to figure this out. So if there's a 0 effect, that would mean that the affect hasn't changed from before reading the text about risks and benefits to after reading it, right? If, however, we have a positive effect, that would mean that there's more of a specific emotion. If we have a negative effect, that would mean there's less of a specific emotion after reading the text compared to before. And what else do we have in this plot? Well, we have changes in happiness plotted in black and changes in sadness plotted in white. Okay, let's take a look at the high relevance group. In the positive mood condition, what we see is that participants reported after reading the text that they felt less happy than before, and they felt more sad. And people in the negative mood condition, who were also in the high relevance group, reported that after reading the text, they felt more happy and less sad. So what do we have here? Well, we have evidence for participants letting some participants in a good mood, they were accessing negative information and it did something with them. It ruined their positive mood a bit, right? On the other hand, people who were in a negative mood, reading this text also did something with them. It actually made them feel better. Now, why is that? Because they focused more on the positive information. So this fits well with our mood as resource account. Participants who were, for whom information was very relevant, but they didn't feel good, they were in a negative mood, they used the stimulus material and they used the way they looked at the information, they used positive information to make themselves feel better. And people who were originally in a good mood, they exposed their good mood and actually allowed themselves to ingest negative information. And that kind of ruined their good mood a little bit, but at least they still got a lot of information. So this is for the high relevance group. And on the other hand, we have the low relevance group. And you can see there, for people who are in a positive mood originally, there's barely any change in mood. They're a little bit less happy after reading the text, but I wouldn't even be sure if this is statistically different from zero. It might be, it might not be. Difficult to tell here because there are no error bars in this plot. For the negative mood condition, participants who were in a low relevance group, so who didn't ingest a lot of caffeine anyway, they reported to feel less sad after the reading the text. Now, and the happiness change again is pretty small. If at all, we have participants in the negative mood condition in the low relevance group feeling a little bit less sad after reading the text about the potential risks and benefits of ingesting caffeine. And now this is not super cleanly consistent with our idea that not a lot of different information was processed in this negative mood, low relevance group, but sometimes that's what the results just are. So to summarize, this means that when information is self-relevant and useful, positive mood can be used as a resource. It can help us face the facts, and even if that means feeling worse than we did before, is an adaptive strategy in that it helps us learn and improve. So what if, however, information is self-threatening, but we can't do anything about it? So for instance, when we face a negative outcome we can't change, like after being rejected from a university or after stocks collapse or whatever, do we still face effects more when we're in a happy mood than if we're in a sad mood? Let's take a look at this follow-up question where here high school students were asked, first of all, to rate their own trait happiness, to say if they were generally a happy or an unhappy person, and relative to their peers, if they thought they were much more or less happy. And then these high school students were asked to rate the universities to which they would apply to go to on 4 criteria: the academic quality, location, affordability, and social life. And they did this at 2 points in time. One time after they just applied to these universities, and one time after they were accepted or rejected. So here what we can do is we can compare the attractiveness of the accepted and rejected alternatives for people depending on their trait happiness this time. So now we're not talking about us in an emotional state, but we're choosing a trait kind of as a stand-in here. So if we look at the results of this study, we have on the left side, this is the schools that participants were accepted to, and we have the overall rating of this college. So how positive or negative did participants feel about this college before and after they got their acceptance letter in this case. And now here we have the sample split up in people who are generally high in trait happiness. So these are people, this would be represented by the black solid line, and people who are generally, as a trait, less happy. So these people are represented by the dotted line. So for the schools where participants were accepted, before just after they had applied, before they found out that they had been accepted, you can see there's a relatively small difference between the desirability, but participants who got accepted and they were high in trait happiness, they upregulated how desirable they found the university they got to after they learned that they had gotten accepted. For the participants who were low in happiness and trait happiness, so the unhappy people, that's the dotted line again, you can see that the desirability rating remains relatively stable. So what we can see here is evidence that participants who are just generally more happy, they do something like a self-serving bias, right? They the thing that they get, they make themselves feel better about. But what happens with the with the participants who get rejected from, with what happens with the desirability ratings of the schools from which participants get rejected? So that's the right plot. And now again, we can see that for participants who don't have high trait happiness, so that's in the dotted line, remains relatively stable before and after learning about being rejected from that school. People who have low trait happiness, they remain relatively stable in how desirable they judge the school to be. But participants who have high trait happiness, they downgrade how they feel about the universities from which they get rejected after they've gotten rejected, right? So where before they got rejected, they felt much better about them. What else can we see in this plot? We can see that people who are who are low in trait happiness generally have the lower desirability ratings for the rejected schools, while for people who are high in trait happiness, we can see that after learning whether they have been accepted or rejected from a specific school, then that's when their mood changes, or their desirability, the rate of desirability of the school changes drastically. So in a way, you could see this as evidence for the mood regulation idea.